Welcome back to Recruiting Blitz. My name's Tim Verghese. We appreciate you guys tuning in. Before we get started, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel. We've got a ton more recruiting intel over there. Some football stories, some softball, baseball coverage as Nebraska's, kind of deep into season in both those sports. And we're getting June started with camps, with official visits, with so much more. And there's day-to-day recruiting coverage over there. I know we do this show every week, but there's even more coverage over at InsideNebraska.com. It's not too late to come check us out before a busy summer kicks off in less than a week. Next Sunday, will Nebraska will kick off their camps and get things going for what's going to be an eventful and busy June, and the news has already started. Obviously, we've got the full slate of 7-on-7 teams expected to compete at the Battle of the Barnyard. We've got that full list of teams over at InsideNebraska.com, a list of the top 10 players we're excited to see at that tournament, and full coverage over the next few weeks and honestly next few days in terms of just the teams we're excited to see, players we're excited to see, how this impacts Nebraska. That's a good opportunity for Nebraska to kick off the summer with such a strong recruiting event. But there's also been some changes to the official visit calendar, both good and bad. So we're going to get right into it. I don't know which one uh, you guys prefer. Good news first, bad news uh, second. That's where we're going to start is with the good news first. Good news. Nebraska got two four-star defenders locked in for June official visits. One long-awaited one, a guy we've talked about a lot on here over the last few months is Jordan Campbell, four-star linebacker out of Miami. Nebraska's been working hard to flip him away from uh, the Hurricanes, the hometown team that he's been committed to since 2023, and got a good boost in terms of their efforts to flip him as he's locked in four official visits. He's going to visit Miami, of course. That's a visit he's had scheduled for some time. He's going to visit Missouri. He's going to visit Auburn, and he's set to visit Nebraska June 13th through the 15th. So I don't think you can read too much into the dates, the order of the visits, or honestly into any of this right now. He's still saying all the right things about his commitment to Miami. I think it's going to be, every team is going to be hard pressed to flip him away from the Hurricanes. I think he's seen everything he needed to see from the hometown school. I think the opportunity to stay close to him is something that intrigues him, but he hasn't stopped exploring national options, specifically Nebraska. He's visited Nebraska twice this spring. This is going to be his third visit to Nebraska this calendar year alone. I think that's a good sign. I think that, just kind of says a lot about what Nebraska's done. This has been a full court press. It's been Matt Rule involved. It's been John Butler involved. It's been linebackers coach Rob Dvorak and outside linebackers coach Philip Simpson involved, and a few other staffers just working on Campbell, communicating him pretty consistently to try and get him to flip. I've said this multiple times. I've said this in multiple places. Would caution optimism here, just in terms of a decision happening anytime soon. I think this is the recruitment that's going to have to continue to get played out into the fall. I wouldn't be surprised if, he takes these visits, still decides to kind of sit tight on his Miami commitment and then waits and sees how all these teams do in the fall. And if Nebraska strings some wins together, you'll hear this a lot from me over the next few weeks. Nebraska strings some wins together, they can change their fortunes in some of these recruitments. But I think it's a good start. I think obviously getting him in town for an official visit is a big deal, and that June 13th weekend is becoming a pretty important weekend for Nebraska in this cycle. Also, in the June 13th weekend, Nebraska was able to lock in four-star edge rusher Xavier Griffin Haynes out of Rolesville, North Carolina. This is a prospect we haven't talked about a whole lot on here. Nebraska offered back in January and made a run then, and quietly behind the scenes, Terry Braden and Philip Simpson have been in touch pretty consistently. There's been some help from a couple other coaches, from their time, specifically Matt Rule from his time with the Carolina Panthers. Just their familiarity with that area has helped Nebraska, and Braden's familiarity with the area, Simpson as well, have all helped Nebraska in that regards. And so now they're scheduled to get an official visit alongside Florida State, Clemson, and Michigan. And honestly, Nebraska has ground to make up there. If you were to ask me straight up, I think of those four, they're running in fourth right now. I think Florida State's the school to beat. Clemson's right there, and Michigan's made a run this spring. But Nebraska is quiet momentum and quiet consistency in this recruitment allowed them to earn an official visit over schools like Texas and Ohio State and South Carolina and schools closer to home that really wanted him bad. And so I think first of all, that's a win. Obviously means nothing if you can't land him. Just the fact that Nebraska was able to overcome some of those schools. But at the same time, there's some ground to make up. That June 13th visit is sandwiched between, visits to Clemson and Florida State and Michigan. And so Nebraska's going to have to make a very strong impression. That's the read I get. It's going to have to be this is the only visit they're really going to get before he's planning to make a decision July 1st. So it's going to take, kind of going all out, rolling out the red carpet and showing him in one visit that Nebraska could potentially be the place for him. So there's a lot of ground to make up, but just to have a foot in the door, I think is a pretty big deal this late in the cycle. For good reasons and bad reasons, June allows for a lot of movement, even with guys that have never visited before or guys that have visited a ton. June is just that month of separation for some schools. It's a month where, teams come from behind. We saw it last year with Petrak, and we saw it with a couple other recruits where Nebraska kind of came from behind in that June official visit month and surged ahead. And so that's what they're going to try and do with Griffin Haynes. But yeah, like I said, a lot of ground to make up in that one. And then just rounding out the good news, Nebraska found a new offensive tackle target, and he's not a guy that they're just kind of taking because they have they feel bad about the top of the board. I don't think that's the case at all. Nebraska went out, specifically running backs coach EJ Bartel, went out to the Northeast and attended a college showcase, saw a couple guys work out, and made a late offer to 2026 offensive tackle Charlie Thom out of Avon Old Farms out there in Connecticut. Tom is a former tight end, has played tight end to this point in his career, and is in the process of switching positions to offensive tackle. He's worked out at a couple showcases and shown some comfort at the position, gained some weight, now stands right around 6'6", 270 pounds. But the big indicator, and talking to him over the weekend, we have that story up at Inside Nebraska later this week. So be sure to check that out. But the big story with him, Nebraska pulled him aside and wanted just to see where he's at athletically. Asked him to broad jump. It's a big athletic indicator for a lot of schools. It's just how explosive you are at the tackle position, at the tight end position. Broad jump's a good indication of that explosiveness, and he broad jumped 9 foot 3 inches, which for an offensive tackle for 270 pounders, pretty incredible. So Nebraska offered on the spot. They've added him to the offensive tackle board, and they're scheduled to get him in town for a visit in June. He's still figuring out the details of how June's going to work. He's either going to make an unofficial visit and potentially camp in front of the staff in June before returning for an official visit, or he may just, opt to just take an official visit. We'll see how that comes together, but I think Nebraska is very well positioned here with, just another kind of under the radar talent they found. They do this every cycle. This is the one it feels like for 2026. There could be another that pops up, one or two that pops up here in the summer, but the staff has shown the ability to kind of leave no stone unturned. Continue to evaluating until the buzzer rings, and they've added to the 26 offensive tackle board, and it's a guy they're pretty ecstatic about, and one that they're hoping to get in the boat sooner rather than later. Now for the bad news. Nebraska missed the cut for four-star defensive lineman Titan Davis, a prospect we've talked about a lot over the last year. One we've mentioned over the last 6 months is arguably Nebraska's top target on the board. We mentioned him a couple of weeks ago as a can't miss target in this 2026 cycle. And Nebraska's out of the mix. They don't even get an opportunity to host him for an official visit. He's down to a final four of USC, Penn State, Alabama, and Michigan. He's replaced his previously scheduled Nebraska official visit with USC. He's going to LA instead of Lincoln the weekend of June 13th through the 15th. And there's no real good way to spin this for Nebraska. This was a recruitment they've invested a lot of time in, a lot of resources in, across multiple staffs at this point, and just in terms of the internal, movement along the defensive staff. It's been across multiple staffs. And it really, I mean, obviously the turnover along the defensive line hasn't helped from, losing Tony White as defensive coordinator, replacing him with John Butler, losing Terrence Knight and replacing him with Terry Braden. Braden's done a good job building a relationship and working to keep Nebraska in this recruitment. Talking to sources just last month, they kind of mentioned that Braden was doing a really good job of making an impression on Davis and his family. Had done a really good job of impressing them with his experience, really, coming along as a personable individual, someone that, they trust um, as a coach for Davis. But now Nebraska sits here a couple weeks later, they're out of the mix. And they have to essentially there's no easy backup option at defensive end right now. We talked about Xavier Griffin-Haynes. Yes, he's going to visit June 13th, but there's a lot of ground to make up. I don't think you can realistically say Nebraska is going to land him at this point until he makes it to campus. Unless that visit goes extremely well, it's far from realistic. Nebraska actually lands him. So they have some work to do along the defensive line, and it's like that in a couple of positions. We talked about this going into last fall. We talked about it at times through the backstretch of last fall. It was really important for Nebraska to win a couple more games last fall because now you're in a position where this is already going to be a smaller 2026 class. And your board is already limited because your general size is limited. And Nebraska's not going to just take a guy just to take a guy. But now they're in a position where the guys that they can't really expand the board right now. Guys are making official visits. Guys are figuring out. There's a flyer or two here or there. We just talked about Charlie Tom. There's a guy or two here or there they can find potentially as a a late bloomer or someone they see as a power four quality player that is not on a whole lot of radars yet. But they've got, there's those options are pretty limited right now. And essentially what they have to do at positions like defensive end, at positions like defensive tackle, potentially a linebacker, depending on how the board continues to play out. They're going to have to wait for these second recruitments. They're already in it with Jordan Campbell. This is the second recruitment of Campbell. They're going to have to wait for the second recruitment of Davis. I think a decision's coming this summer. I think him cutting down to four gives you pretty good indication that, he's nearing closer to a decision. I think it's between Alabama and Michigan, truthfully, between that top four. And Nebraska's gonna have to try and string some wins together early in the 2025 season, and then hope that some of these guys are interested by, the momentum Nebraska has on the field and the momentum they're gaining off the field. And that's Davis. That's going to be guys on the at the line in the linebacker room, whether that's a Ja'Cory Smith who they'll try to flip from Oklahoma, whether that's a Keenan Harris who just committed to Mizzou, whether they try to flip him away, whether it's at wide receiver Nasir Rankin who just committed to Illinois and comes off the board for Nebraska, one of Nebraska's top slot targets. Speaking of receiver recruiting, it's been like there that's another position where it's not as much of a need as the defensive line is. Nebraska has to address the defensive line through the high school ranks this cycle. I think that's something that's just important from every angle, no matter how you look at it. From an NIL standpoint, it's cheaper to invest in high school defensive linemen, regardless of the caliber of player. It's just cheaper to find a quality four-star or blue chip type defensive end recruit at the high school level and invest in him from an NIL standpoint than it is in the transfer portal. Those guys are hard to find, and the true impact players that can impact at the power four level, their price tag goes up real quick. So Nebraska's going to have to figure it out along the defensive line. Wide receiver as well. I don't think it's again they'll have to resort the board a little bit. Rankin comes off the board. He committed to Illinois. Nebraska's no longer going to get an official visit from Jabari Brady, the four-star wide receiver from South Florida. That was more of a mutual decision between Nebraska and Brady. Nebraska kind of checked back in, had him on campus a couple of times this spring. But overall, I don't. I just think both sides are moving on to different options. Nebraska, he was a guy that over the last years is slipping down the rankings a good bit. His film is kind of tapered off. His development's kind of tapered off. That's not to say he still can't be a quality power four player. There's still a lot of intrigue in his frame and his overall athleticism, but he hasn't taken the steps forward that people thought. And at this point, I think his options are pretty limited. Nebraska decided to move in another direction. Like I said, they're not going to take a guy just to fill a spot. They want guys that can contribute at the power four level. Dahil Shorts isn't going to compromise his room for someone he doesn't think can contribute. So Nebraska's going to move on. They're going to find other options at the receiver position, but those options are growing slim as at the high school ranks. Wide receiver is a position they can invest in through the transfer portal, and frankly, they're pretty deep and young at that position right now. You've got an Isaiah Hunter who's going to be around for a couple of years. You've got Ja'Cory Barney who's going to be here for a couple of years. You've got Cortez Mills and Isaiah Mosey and Jeremiah Jones coming in this summer. You've got Quinn Clark in the room. You've got Jaron Bonner for, potentially another year or two. So you've got experience in the room. You've got depth. And you have youth. So while it's a position Nebraska still needs to address this cycle, it's not as big of a need as defensive line. Even linebacker, I thought Nebraska did a good job last cycle. They've missed out on some targets. As long as they can flip a big fish like a Jordan Campbell, as long as you land a big fish at the linebacker position, I'm not too concerned. I think Nebraska is going to put together a pretty good DB class. I like the work that Addison Williams has done. so far this cycle. If he can close this June, it would be a good thing for Nebraska. Hold on to CJ Bronaugh, land, one or two more of these top DBs that are set to visit in June. On the offense, offensive line, I think they're going to put together a pretty solid interior class. They obviously need to land one of those elite offensive tackles they're in. We've talked about that plenty this cycle. I think they're going to put together a pretty solid running back class. I think they're waiting on Dezephon Walker. I'm not encouraged by where things stand with Brian Bonner right now, but I think they can pull it off with Dezephon Walker. I think they can pull it off with Jamal Rule potentially. And even if they don't, again, that's another position. I think they're going to be able to find some options and address either through the portal or recircling or circling back on someone in the fall. Closing off, there's been some developments on the tight end board. They lost Camden Jensen to UCLA last weekend. He committed after an official visit there. We got the update late last week that four-star tight end Lincoln Watkins has added Florida to his official visit schedule. So he's going to visit Florida June 6th through the 8th, and then going to visit Nebraska June 20th through the 22nd. And right now, Florida has the momentum heading into the summer. There was a point this spring, even just a couple of weeks ago, where I felt Nebraska had all the momentum, were well positioned to get this recruitment closed in June. Not the case anymore. Florida offered a couple of weeks ago. They got him on campus. They've impressed. They've made him feel like a priority target. And, essentially this recruitment's going to come down to, can Nebraska get him on that official visit? There's a gap now between June 8th, when he leaves that Florida official visit, and June 20th, when he's supposed to arrive at Nebraska, where I expect the Gators to go all in on preventing him from making that Nebraska official visit. I think they're going to do whatever they can to get him committed, to get him to shut things down, to prevent him from making that trip to Lincoln. As long as Nebraska gets him into town June 20th, I think they have a very good shot of pulling that one off and getting over the top and regaining the momentum there. But again, heading into the summer, Florida's kind of taken the lead there. And then there's four-star tight end Luke Sorensen, the other scheduled uh, tight end official visitor that's supposed to come in this summer. He is, as we're talking, still expected to visit Nebraska June 5th through the 7th. It's a bit of a weird date, but that's the date he figured out. That weekend could get swapped out for Notre Dame, who recently offered and has his attention. And I think regardless of what happens with that weekend, Penn State's a favorite. And I think Penn State's kind of pulling away from the pack at this point. I think USC's still in the mix. I think USC's the other school um, giving him something to think about. But Penn State's a school that's really starting to pull away, really starting to create some momentum there. And it wouldn't surprise me if the Nittany Lions get it done before that June 6th weekend comes around. So regardless of what happens, what he schedules for that weekend, there's a chance he's just off the board by then. So a lot of work to do for Marcus Satterfield, a lot of work to do for Terry Braden, some work to do for Rob Dvoracek, Addison Williams, and the bunch. Nikhil Shorts has some work to do. But again, some positions, it's easier to find backup options than others. But defensive line right now, Nebraska's going to have to brace for some second recruitments. Hope that this fall see some strong play out of Williams and Minari, some strong play out of Keona Davis and Riley Van Poppel, and sees a unit that impresses some guys in St. Louis, specifically Titan Davis, impresses some national defensive line targets too, and hope that brings connections, his time in Kansas City, and overall Nebraska's approach, if they can string together some wins in the fall, can lead to just some open hearts and some open feelings from some of these top defensive linemen who are committed elsewhere or are training elsewhere to reconsider Nebraska. And that's about it for us. We appreciate you guys tuning in. We'll have more updates through the week over at InsideNebraska.com. Camps start later this week, so stay tuned to the Insiders board and to all my social accounts. I'm at X over at Tim Verghese. Follow Steve Marek as well. We'll be out at camp June 1st, and Nebraska has their 7-on-7 tournament June 6th, and then we've got camps throughout the rest of the month. So we'll be in Lincoln, boots on the ground for those, getting you active coverage from that. We're going to see a lot of movement really fast. We're going to see new offers. We're going to see new potentially commitments on the board. We're going to see official visits, and it's going to be fluid. We've already seen so many changes to the official visit calendar. It's going to keep happening. We're going to see some potential additions to the board over the next few days. We're going to see some potential redactions from the board. And so a lot happening, a lot going on. Stay tuned to Inside Nebraska. Stay tuned to the Inside Nebraska YouTube channel. We'll be back with another episode next week.